Thank you, Ian. And the main advantage of my talk this morning, there's going to be a lot of music, which I think we could do with hearing more. After yesterday, certainly we heard some music, but I think I have a story to tell about which there is far too much to say, as I realized the moment I began to write down my thoughts about it. But I think that maybe just in sketching the outlines of this story, it may raise some issues which you might want to ponder about later. And also, it'll give us a chance to hear some fairly remarkable music as well. Because what struck me when I began to think about it was the way that since the Renaissance in particular, Western classical music has begun to register a kind of response to war, which it's difficult to parallel in other forms. You may have some suggestions, in which case I'm very ready to hear them. But music has been involved in war and in warfare probably for as far back as we can record and beyond, hasn't it? But it's very much been about the march, if you think about it, the march with its four-square rhythms, about instilling that sense of corporate identity, about the movement of the feet, about making you part of a corps, setting your resolution in process, thinking like an organism, a collective organism rather than an individual, and very much used as part of rhythm, very much used as part of parade ground activity. The sergeant major draws on it in order to absolutely knock out that sense of freedom, of thought, of individuality, of potential rebellion, and instill a responsiveness, a collective responsiveness to orders. Music has been very much involved in celebrating victory, and music has been very much involved also through religious rite in lamenting in masses for the dead and other forms of expressions of collective grief. But what interests me is how I said, since the Renaissance, art music, classical music, has begun to register a different kind of response, and it's a story that seems to have grown throughout the years. One of the first examples of a published Western classical work or collection of works where war is clearly indicated as a subject matter is Monteverdi's Madrigali Guerrieri ed Amorosi, his madrigals, warlike and amorous madrigals, they're described. These are music in which musical depiction is very much a part of the sound world. But what's interesting here is that war doesn't seem to be depicted as actual war, but much more as an allegory of love, the hunt for love, the battle for love, the conquering of the desired object. Feminists might want to take that one and run with it a little bit later. You're welcome. But as the Baroque era develops from Monteverdi, we begin to find depictions of war actually as war, not so much picture postcard images of war, picturesque images of war, entertainment ideas of war. But we begin to get some kind of suggestion of an impact of war in a brighter sense. And one very interesting early example of this is to be found in the works of a highly interesting and somewhat eccentric German composer called Heinrich Bieber. No relation of the contemporary Bieber, spelled differently. And a collection of a little extraordinary suite for 10 solo strings called Battaglia, Battle, that he wrote in 1670. Now, the date is highly significant. This is only slightly more than 20 years after the end of the 30 Years' War. What's it doing to what I'm saying? I don't know. The 30 Years' War was a devastating war. The dates are 1618 to 1648. It was exactly 30 years. Some estimations of the effect of that war, well, I remember reading that the population of the German-speaking territories before the outbreak of the 30 Years' War was around 12 million. By the end of it, it was around 4 million. Now, war in the Middle Ages particularly was often a highly localized phenomenon. Battles were quite small scale compared to what we know now. Italian battles were often conducted according to quite extraordinary courtly rules, whereby the actual amount of violent engagement was rather small. But this war was devastating in its impact. And indeed, its consequences, the trauma of that impact, continued to resonate with Germans until the 20th century. It's extraordinary the way that complete. This was the war in which basically after the Reformation, Catholic and Protestant forces struggled for supremacy, and then the major world powers got involved, and there was devastation, as I said, on a massive scale. But another interesting phenomenon about the 30 Years' War was this was the first war in which, as far as we know, mercenaries played an important part. The paid freelance soldier with no particular allegiance to a cause here or there. And Bieber's Battaglia, well, there's a very entertaining depiction of the battle with imitations of side drums and even flying arrows. Bieber asks the violinists at one point, this is the first recorded use of this effect, to turn their bows around and hit the strings with the back of the bow so that you get the sound of flying arrows. Donk! And it's all rather fun. Even the lament for the wounded at the end, you think, is maybe a little bit more pictorial than actually an expression of shock and grief. But there is a section in which we hear the mercenaries singing songs in the camp. And this is quite extraordinary because there is a suggestion of some terrible, chaotic, subversive element beginning to creep into the art of war. Basically, Bieber has all the 10 soloists, 10 string players, play folk songs, the kind of songs you imagine that the mercenaries would sing, and you can probably imagine that the words wouldn't be very repeatable either. And he puts them together, and remember, this is early Baroque. This is the 17th century, not Charles Ives. Isn't that extraordinary? That's the camp of mercenaries, the new freelance, disorderly rabble element beginning to creep into warfare, registered by Heinrich Bieber. Another important step forward in music, registering the impact of war in new ways, can be found in the music of Joseph Haydn. Now, many of you will know, some of you will know anyway, that one of Haydn's 104 numbered symphonies, number 100, is called The Military, and it appeared in 1794. And I've got a review of the first performance, which was here in London. Another new symphony by Haydn was performed for the second time. The middle movement was again received with absolute shouts of applause. Encore, encore, resounded from every seat. The ladies themselves could not forbear. It is the advancing to battle, the march of men, the sounding of the charge, the thundering of the onset, the clash of arms, the groans of the wounded, and what may well be called the hellish roar of war, all increase to a climax of horrid sublimity, which, if other can conceive, Haydn alone can execute. At least he alone hitherto has effected these wonders. And the passage the reviewer seems to be thinking of particularly is at the end of the second movement, where at last really recognizable sounds of military activity, military music. But even for a moment, Haydn, it may sound rather tame to our ears, but this is an example of music registering something of the shock of war in the dissonance that follows the trumpet fanfare that we hear at the beginning. So this is Haydn's Military Symphony, second movement. But just for a moment, that timpani, the trumpets, and then that moment of dissonance just from the orchestra, that would have been quite disturbing to an audience of Haydn's time. And that in itself is nothing compared to what he achieved a little later, 4 years later, in what we sometimes known as the Nelson Mass. But Haydn entitled the Missa in Angustiis, the Mass in time of fear, very close to the German word Angst there, a word which I'm sure many of us will recognize, which was composed as the Napoleonic Wars that followed the French Revolution were beginning to send ripples or indeed tsunamis of fear all the way across Europe. The opening movement of the Mass, the Nelson Mass, Kyrie, Lord have mercy, has an almost operatic depiction of the fear and terror and confusion. The four soloists register the shock in the most extraordinarily dramatic, operatic, theatrical way. The Haydn scholar H.C. Robbins Landon says that the listener hears, for perhaps the first time in music history, the presence of real fear, nay, terror. And then later in the Mass, towards the end, comes the movement called the Benedictus. Now, the words here are, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Now, we can't be absolutely sure of this at this point, but it seems that at round about the time that Haydn was composing this movement, he had the news, which would have taken a long time to travel to Vienna from the Mediterranean Sea, that Nelson had defeated Napoleon's fleet at the Battle of the Nile. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Is Haydn actually here thinking specifically of Nelson, the liberator from this terrible godless threat of Napoleon? There is an extraordinary moment when an already quite agitated choral expression in this movement. It's unusual for a Benedictus, which is normally a serene movement, to have such a high level of anxiety in it. Suddenly is almost invaded by the stark sounds of fanfares and of trumpets and drums. It's almost as though at this point we're beginning to sense that music can register something of the scar tissue of the conflict of music. And back to more conventional expressions of rejoicing in the Hosanna there at the end, but it takes the music a little longer to recover, doesn't it, from the shock of that massive trumpet onslaught in the middle of the Mass there. And this clearly left a mark on Haydn's pupil and admirer, Beethoven.